Planning ahead for your cruise involves a little bit more than just picking your destination, booking your cruise, and deciding on your excursions. Another crucial aspect that some cruisers tend to overlook is understanding the tipping culture. Cruises are billed as all-inclusive, and gratuities are generally required, included, / prepaid. On my first ever cruise, I just assumed that tipping in addition to those built-in gratuities, it wasn't a thing. And as someone who tends to be a generous tipper, I was really embarrassed later to learn that while additional tips are certainly not required, they are customary. Well, somewhat. So let's talk about that. Cruise gratuities are a hot button issue. So before discussing cruise tips, I will say there is no right or wrong answer regarding what is acceptable or whether or not you should even tip at all on top of the included gratuities. This is totally a personal choice, and the approaches to it vary widely from cruiser to cruiser. It can also be a controversial and very subjective topic. I see this debate rage in all the cruise message boards on social media daily. You'll find some cruisers who staunchly oppose additional tipping, but then others who tip generously in addition to those included gratuities. So the guidance I'm about to provide is drawn from both my personal experiences, opinions, and what I see as the general consensus within cruising groups. First, let's talk about included gratuities. Unless you're sailing on Virgin voyages where everything truly is mostly all-inclusive, including gratuities, part of the compensation for cruise ship employees comes from tips. Now, most of the major cruise lines, including Celebrity, Holland America Line, Carnival, Princess, Royal Caribbean, and others, have a policy of automatically adding a predetermined gratuity amount to your onboard account. These are what are called included gratuities. So what are prepaid gratuities? Okay, this can be confusing because these included gratuities are often called prepaid gratuities, but I prefer to call them included or required gratuities instead of prepaid gratuities because you do not have to prepay them. Cruise lines will often ask and even encourage cruisers to pay those included gratuities in advance when they book and pay for their cruise, but you are under no obligation to do so. Cruisers who opt to not pay gratuities in advance will just later see that charge for gratuities hit their stateroom account, generally on the last evening of their sailing. So is it required that cruisers prepay for included gratuities? No, and I personally never do. I see zero benefit at all in paying for something before I have to. Plus, as a business professor, I always get stuck on the concept of the time value of money. Nerd alert. Plus, should you have to cancel your cruise for whatever reason, while prepaid gratuities are generally refundable, I'd rather not have to deal with waiting to get a refund and get my money back if I have to cancel versus not having prepaid them at all. Again, why would you pay for something before you have to? Now, this is a controversial question. Can I have gratuities removed from my bill? Passengers can decline this automatic gratuity charge and instead choose either not to tip at all or to tip employees directly on the cruise. And this is just according to their preferences. Now, to do this though, you have to inform the front desk of this decision. You have to do it in person. And some cruise lines like Carnival will not allow cruisers to make this request until that last night of the sailing. So if you're on a Carnival cruise, it's the last night, you see this huge line at guest services, that's usually what it is. It's a long line of cruisers who intend to ask to have gratuities removed from their stateroom bill. Unless this request is specifically made at the precise time and in person, or your required gratuities were already prepaid in advance, the gratuities charge will be included on your final bill and just charged to your credit card on file. So how much are required gratuities on a cruise and who gets them? Required gratuities are calculated on a per passenger per day basis, and it typically ranges from about $12 to $16 per person per day. The funds collected are then distributed to the cruise line's predetermined allocation formula, and it goes to various onboard staff, including cabin stewards, bartenders, baggage handlers, restaurant staff like waiters, and other generally lower paid staff positions. Now, the value of included gratuities is ensuring that it's not just those customer-facing staff, like wait staff in the main dining room, who benefit from cruiser tips. Because whether you realize or not, there are lots of behind-the-scenes staff and crew who are hustling and working really hard to ensure a great guest experience on your cruise that you may never see or cross paths with. And therefore, you would never tip them directly. That's why I like the included gratuities, because it ensures a fair distribution to all employees. Now, as I mentioned, some cruisers choose to tip on top of those included gratuities. So let's talk about some staff members on a cruise that generally get tips. First is your room steward or your stateroom attendant. This is the crew member responsible for maintaining your stateroom. They clean it daily, they address all of your needs, they make sure that you have extra pillows if that's what you need. So most cruisers kind of generally get to know their stewards. The stewards usually know them by name, so they choose to tip in addition to the required gratuities, especially because they usually are seeing their work visibly and they're seeing how hard they work. Now there's no hard or fast rule. And again, completely optional. This is just what I do. I personally tip around $20 per person for the week for shorter sailings up to 5 nights and more for longer sailings. And again, this is per sailing, not per night. So if I'm sailing with my 2 children, I'll tip $60 for the 5-day cruise. Now, some cruisers choose to tip nothing, some tip less than me, and some tip more, way more. Again, there's no right or wrong, nor is there a standard. Now, if I get exceptional service, I'll tip more. On the rare occasion I get really bad service, I won't tip extra at all, and I'll just let the included gratuities cover that. Not only is the subject of whether to tip and how much to tip highly debated, but there's even some discussion about when to tip. Some cruisers are convinced that tipping their steward on the first day is best because that ensures enhanced service during the sailing, whereas others prefer to wait until the end, once they've determined that the service rendered was quality enough to deserve an additional tip anyway. As for me, I generally do a split. I tip my steward $20 on the first day with a promise of more to come later. Room stewards generally attempt to meet up with the guests in their assigned staterooms on the first day, greet them by name, say hello, introduce themselves, give you their card so you know how to call them if you need something. So when I meet my steward that first time, again, I usually give that $20 and assure them there will be more later. That way they know I'm a tipper and maybe they will give me better service. I don't know. And then at the end of my cruise, I leave the remainder of my tip in the room on the last night. Another person to consider tipping is the porter. A porter is the employee of the cruise terminal responsible for assisting cruisers with their luggage. When you're getting on the ship, they'll take your bags if you check them, and they'll make sure it gets on the ship. So if you choose to check your bags, many cruisers choose to tip their porters. This can be anywhere from $1 or $2 per bag, or sometimes if it's maybe me and my children and their friends, I'll just give a larger sum for all of us. Again, there's no right or wrong here. I generally do, if I tip per bag, I'll tip about $2 per bag, which is fairly customary. Although it is good practice to tip more if you have really heavy bags or bags that are oversized. Another position to consider extra tips is the main dining waitstaff. I typically choose flexible dining in the main dining room, meaning I have a different wait team most nights. So I generally tip a couple of bucks after each meal. If I have set dining and enjoy the benefit of having the same waitstaff team every night, I'll generally tip on that last evening, around $20 per person in my party for the entire sailing. And I'll hand this directly to the main waiter with the instruction to please share that with their assisting waitstaff. Now this one's a little less common, and that is the buffet waitstaff. Now tipping the buffet waitstaff is less common compared to other staff roles on a cruise ship, primarily because the interaction here is typically pretty minimal and the service is more behind the scenes. Now personally, I find it thoughtful to leave behind $1 or $2 for the buffet waitstaff after dining in the buffet, especially if I've noticed them providing exceptional service. For example, if a staff member has been particularly attentive in quickly clearing my plates or maybe helping me find a seat during busy meal times, I like to leave a little behind to show my appreciation. And this is a small token that can go a long way in acknowledging hardworking crew members who often go unnoticed in the bustling buffet environment. Another commonly tipped area is when it comes to beverage service. Enjoying a nice drink, of course, is one of the many pleasures of cruising, whether it's a specialty coffee, my favorite, or a cocktail to unwind in the evening. And this is especially the case if you bought the drink package. Beverage service can happen anywhere on a cruise ship. Really, there are hawking drinks everywhere. Bars, lounges, casinos, poolsides, specialty cafes, the main dining room, pretty much everywhere. So when it comes to tipping for beverage service, usually tipping $1 or $2 per drink is fairly customary. Now be careful with this one though, because some cruise lines will tack on an automatic 18% gratuity and have that already included, so you don't want to inadvertently double tip. Now a pro tip, tipping for beverage service can sometimes be a strategic move rather than an act of goodwill, because it's probably going to ensure that you get better service. I hate to say it, but with cruise line cutbacks in recent years, it can sometimes prove challenging to get timely beverage service because they're short-staffed. And this especially applies to hotspots like the casino or the pools. Tipping generously upon the receipt of your very first drink can go a long way in making sure the service staff remember you and make sure that you're a priority for service going forward for the rest of your cruise. Another person to consider with tips is your excursion providers. Excursions are a fantastic way to explore ports of call, from everything from guided city tours to adventure activities like ziplining. If you hire a private driver, they'll often provide you with personalized service, taking you to hidden gems and offering you local guidance and insights. Now, for such services, I typically tip around $20 per person in my party, adjusting based on the quality and length of the service. Similarly, for guided tours where the guide shares detailed narratives and ensures a smooth experience, a $20 tip is pretty standard, with more for exceptional services. Adventure excursions like snorkeling or ziplining may also warrant a similar tip just to acknowledge the specialized guidance support and keeping you safe. It's important to note that if you plan to tip, you want to make sure you carry cash for cruise tips, because not all excursion providers or drivers accept credit cards. Even in foreign ports of call, tips in US currency are generally enthusiastically accepted. When deciding on the tip amount, consider the service quality, group size, and tour length. But whatever you decide to tip, it's just completely up to you. Now let's talk about how much money to bring on a cruise. It's impossible to provide a one-size-fits-all advice about how much money to bring on a cruise. It really is. It's so subjective and it varies widely from person to person. So instead of giving you an amount, which would literally be impossible, I'm going to share with you some of the things that you need to plan to spend money for on a cruise, and then you just have to determine what you think you'll spend in each of these categories in order to devise a total planned cruise budget. But before we do that, let's talk about the issue of cash and whether it's even needed. So is cash needed on a cruise? A convenience of cruising is that all of your onboard charges are simply billed to the card attached to your stateroom account. So on the ship, other than optional tips, which we just talked about, it's essentially a cashless experience. Therefore, it's unnecessary to worry too much about having cash on hand when you're milling about the cruise ship, aside from those tips. Having cash for your visits to ports of call, however, that's advisable, and more on that in just a moment. But first, let's talk about whether or not it's necessary to convert currency for a cruise. Now, most ports are commercialized and they're accustomed to American travelers. So it's usually not necessary to convert US currency to foreign currencies. That's assuming that you're on a cruise that departs from the US, things like those Caribbean itineraries. This obviously is going to differ if you're embarking on a sailing in another country. If you're taking a European cruise that departs out of Amsterdam, you may need to convert your currency. For sailings outside of the United States, most of those don't require currency conversion. Most port vendors accept US currency credit and debit cards, although depending on the terms of your cards, you may incur an international transaction fee. Also, while most ports of calls on sailings that disembark from the United States will accept US currency, it's important to note that some of them, and I've really encountered this a lot in those smaller Caribbean islands like Antigua and St. Lucia, they may accept US currency, but only if the bills are in good condition. So no rips or tears, the bills can't be overly worn, and there cannot be any writing on the bills at all. Further, while they may accept US currency, they might provide change back to you in the form of local currency, so be prepared for that. When budgeting for your cruise, both how much cash to bring and how much you aim to spend overall, here are some general categories to consider. So again, think about each category, decide what you want to try to spend, and calculate your personal cruise spending budget accordingly. The first category is tips. As we just discussed, you may choose to tip employees on your cruise in addition to those included or prepaid gratuities. And you may also choose to tip service providers on your port day excursions. If so, you'll want to bring cash, including lots of singles and smaller bills. Another area is excursions. If you book an excursion through the cruise line, the charge will be billed to your stateroom account or prepaid if you booked in advance. If you book with an independent tour provider, you'll either pay in advance or sometimes on the day of your excursion. If paying on the day of your excursion, it's important to note some tour operators only take cash, although they usually will take US currency, but it's important to verify this with them in advance. Confirm whether or not they take cards, and if it's cash only, if they'll take US currency. I once booked an excursion in Belize and I just assumed they would take credit cards as payment, and I got all the way to the destination and ended up in a very awkward spot when I learned only then and there that it's a cash only situation. And I had not enough cash and there were no ATMs anywhere. I was able to work it out, but it created a pretty stressful moment that could have ruined the entire day. Taxis. Some taxi services at cruise ports accept credit cards, but this is never a guarantee. Even taxi providers at wildly busy commercialized ports like Cozumel, one of the biggest in the world, those taxi drivers typically do not accept credit cards, cash only, although they do usually take US currency. And for those less developed ports of call like Progreso and Costa Maya, it is almost a guarantee that taxi drivers will take cash only. So plan for your transportation costs and make sure you have enough cash on hand for that. Souvenirs. This is a hugely variable expense, but know that while most port souvenir vendors will take cards, paying cash might save you money because that vendor might give you a discount for paying cash because they then don't incur those credit card transaction fees. You may also have more leverage with negotiation by paying in cash. So getting a better price may incentivize you to pay with cash versus card. And the last category to consider are extras, all the miscellaneous stuff. Because while cruises are all-inclusive, the cruise lines make a lot of money upselling cruisers on a ton of extras once you're on board. This includes things like photos, Wi-Fi, casino expenditures, specialty dining, drinks if you didn't buy the drink package. Some of these things can be prepaid, but if you didn't pay in advance, budget for these as part of your cruise planning process. You won't generally need cash for these things. They'll be billed to your stateroom account, but it's going to be an expense that you will incur if you do choose to partake in any of these miscellaneous things. And unless you plan to only eat on the ship and plan your meals around your time in port, you're likely going to incur costs with food and drinks when it comes to being off the ship on port days. So plan for that as well. Now, while this advice is generally applicable, I again want to stress the personal nature of both tipping and financial planning for expenses at port destinations. There really is no one-size-fits-all approach. I can't simply give you a number and tell you bring this much money. It's so independent. It's so subjective. What I recommend is using these guidelines, knowing the categories, make sure you understand situations where you might need cash versus card, and plan accordingly.